Islamic invasion of India was the bloodiest in human history. I don't call him a saint because he was not. If you just study the history, you'll find that he was responsible for the Goa Inquisition. The whole Christian world, they don't like yoga. Majority, Vatican banned yoga.
Hello, a very good evening. Very good evening. Welcome back to Swarajya Conversations. This is your host Sharan Sethi. Today I'm really privileged to be joined by Mr. Kanchan Banerjee, who's come out with a very interesting book titled The Crash of Civilizations. Kanchanji, namaste. Thank you very much for joining us.
Namaste, namaste. I'm so happy to join you in this conversation, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And indeed, the book has raised a lot of eyebrows, and I did go through as many parts of it as it was possible. So basically, you've comprehensively covered a lot of things that eventually led to the crash of not just the Indian civilization per se, but a lot of civilizations around the world. And in return, you also mention pre-Islamic Arabia. You touch upon how Christianity was introduced to India and a lot of the proselytization that happened later. So let's go step by step. And may I begin by asking what aroused the curiosity in you to write this book, sir?
Yes. So I am a person of science. My background is computer science, and I always thought that India was a great country. India was highly developed. But then when we look at today, what happened? Why our economy, our society, our entire civilization seems like almost doomed, like nothing is left from the ancient times that are. So I started studying that, why India is in this state. So what are the causes? So that's where I started researching. I have been researching for a long time, but during the COVID time, I had a good opportunity to stay home and study.
Right.
So there are, we must understand why we should even go back in history. Why should we study history? That is a very important point. As we know that Will Durant wrote a lot about India when he visited India, American historian. He said that the Islamic invasion of India was the bloodiest in human history, not just Indian history. Human history was bloodiest. That brings some curious questions. What really happened to us? Do we see that in our history books? What these things are those covered up? And that question everybody should ask. And then I said, okay, let's study what happened. Then you look at the Mughal period. Basically, it's less than 200 years of actual Mughal rule in Delhi. And that was 1526 to 1707 when Aurangzeb died. After Aurangzeb died, actually the whole Mughal empire basically disappeared slowly due to the Marathas and the Sikhs. But yet, in the history books, you will find that that is really ignored our Aham kingdom in Assam. They lasted for 598 years. Compare that with Mughals. Our Pandya history lasted for about 755 years. Even the Palas in Bengal and Bihar area, they were 424 years. Have we read that in the history books? We do not. We have footnotes and small, but on Mughal era, all you read is Mughal glory. Then I found another major problem with glorification of the Mughal era.
Yeah.
Grand Trunk Road, GT Road, that was built by Sher Shah. That is what we read in history. He ruled Delhi for a few years, 4-5 years, and he was fighting 3-4 different fronts at the same time. When did he have time to build Grand Trunk Road? And now you go back to history and you find this road was existing during the time of Buddha. So, this kind of glorification and also the whitewashing of what atrocities were done to us for centuries, that's where I find that it is very important that we need to learn our history from our own. And this, you may say, whatever has happened, happened. Now let's look forward. Really
Yeah.
speaking, two parts are there. One is that you need to learn what happened to us so it doesn't repeat. As you know, the American poet Maya Angelou said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. However, if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So, what happened to us can happen again, and we can see the signs in many parts of India that
Right.
may repeat. So, we want to progress further. We don't want to look back. We want to have a more glorious India, so that we need to learn history and learn from the history. And
Thank
that's
you
the
very much.
reason I wrote this book.
Thank you very much for introducing your thought regarding why you started this book. Um, a few things that came to my mind, I've jotted down all the points that I wanted to discuss. Obviously, it's a very fat book, so it wouldn't be possible for us to discuss everything in the given amount of time. But before we proceed any further, there were a couple of things that our viewers must know. One is that you are finding me in a very unusual background using my phone, and the reason is that I've been traveling. And Kanchanji has been more than patient in bearing the delays with me. I think,
That's not a problem.
secondly, this episode is very important because it's not just particularly focused on a historical event or a certain period in history, but it explains the overall canvas as to why humanity as a civilization has seen a downfall because of invasive forces. Now, when I come to that, Kanchanji, you were also mentioning about how Islamic crimes were whitewashed, throughout history, and it's even happening today. In that sense, it's also seeped into our popular culture. Would you agree? Where a lot of our youngsters are using terms which are rather Abrahamic. And this has subconsciously entered into the minds of a lot of people. So, why is it important that young people need to be aware? Or is it also okay if we just move it on as passing, where we say, it's not a big deal that it's just a few phrases? So, what's your thought on this?
First of all, our culture is based on the darshanas that our rishis, ancients developed. And the Abrahamic religions uh, is a contrast to the pluralistic viewpoint of India, the Hindus, the Vedic civilization that we have, the Hindu civilization. For example, uh, the idea of iconoclasm, breaking of murtis, it's embedded in the Abrahamic tradition.
Right.
So when it comes to Hindus, we don't live without the murtis. Some people may decide to not to worship murtis, but the you see the stark contrast between the two traditions. Just giving one example. So when terminologies that are used by these exclusive cultures were not inclusive, it's like a only my path is right. When you come from that exclusive philosophy or ideology and use certain terms, that will have definite impact on the minds of people. For example, um, rest in peace.
Yeah.
When someone dies, this is a fashion these days. I hear a lot of people are saying rest in
RIP.
peace, RIP. You know,
Yeah.
our tradition, the Indian tradition, the Hindu tradition, majority of us, we cremate our bodies after death. And that cremation is done because our body needs to go back to the Panchabhuta, to the five elements, and the Atman releases and travels to next life or mukti or moksha, whatever. Now, when the idea of Abrahamic rest in peace, RIP, is that you are buried, the body is there, the skeleton, whatever is left, and there will be judgment day when God or Allah or whoever, Yoha, will come during that day, and then will be asked, have you done this, this, this? If you have not followed the religion, then you're supposed to go to hell. Or if you followed the religion properly, you will go to heaven forever. Now, that is so in between that judgment day and the death, there will be peaceful resting in the grave. So, why Hindus should use that? RIP, rest in peace. This is an example. And there are many such words. I'll give you another word, which is shaheed. And a lot of people will raise eyebrows. Shaheed is actually a term who is dying for jihad, for religious war. That person is called, I mean, very specifically, it has been defined within Quran and Hadith who is a shaheed. Now, for us, for Hindus, why should we be using that term for our people, especially our freedom fighters or soldiers dying in battles? We have great words like hutatma, viratma. This type of words should be Hindus use. So you see the limitation of language makes a huge difference. Another example, for example, is dua. Everybody is using dua, dua. So we translate that ashirvad or blessings. But if you study the meaning of dua, it is not really like that. Even many Muslims cannot do dua without certain specific practices. Even it is not allowed to all Muslims to perform dua. And we need to understand that there's a difference between ashirvad and dua. Very similar to that is the word God. God is a relatively new term. The word was not used even few centuries ago. So we interchange God with Ishwar, God with Bhagwan, God with Devata. Ishwar is a term that has a vast meaning. Brahman or Devata or Bhagwan, it has deep, deep meaning. So when we use the word God for say Bhagwan Mahadev, God Mahadev, then actually you're imposing the Christian idea of God into Mahadev, not the other way around. So language, terminologies in a culture is very important. And our language, Sanskrit, is extremely advanced language. And it is a language of the Devatas. That means it's a language of inclusiveness, pluralism, acceptance. So that is in the book. I have given a number of such usage of such words, which we Hindus should look at and think, why should we use those words?
To what you just said, because Bollywood is guilty of popularizing a lot of these terms like mashallah and dua and all of that. I think they would say isko bhi dua mein yaad rakhte hain. But
Uh,
so it's been trivialized to a large extent, and I think there is an awakening. There is a sense of acknowledgement even among youngsters today, where they would actually say Om Shanti instead of RIP. And I think that slowly that revivalism is slowly taking place in that sense. You also speak about the introduction of Christianity to India, and the rather forgotten or glorified parts of the existence in India. So as far as that is concerned, what's the story? And you also write a chapter where you mention about Jesus in India. That's something that a lot of authors have also pondered upon and they've explored into that. But I wanted to get your perspective on that.
so to me, Jesus Christ was a great personality. And if he at all existed, because there are still questions whether there's a historical Jesus Christ or not. So I don't want to get into that debate. Instead, you may see, okay, what Christianity means to India. And that the beginning was very sad. Because Saint Thomas, who is supposed to be one of the apostles, who was part of the few people who were close to Jesus Christ, he came to India apparently, and he started the first church in the south. But I haven't found too many solid evidences of that. It's probably a legend. It could be true. I don't have. But then when, uh, but there are churches as old as Christianity is. Probably there are churches in India. Um, then came the Portuguese people. They're the one who started to do some massive damage. So, for example, this so-called Saint Xavier's.
Yeah.
I don't call him a saint because he was not. If you just study the history, you will find that he was responsible for the Goa Inquisition. Goa Inquisition was nothing but to persecute people who were not of Christian faith, you know, including Hindus, Muslims, and the Jewish people also came. And they were tortured, killed, and temples and mosques were destroyed by these Portuguese Christian missionaries. Um, so that was the big impact. Even Saint Thomas, even if he was real, he was killed by the locals because they didn't like him. He was murdered. So the early Christianity in India was not very pleasant, though the oldest church could be there and so forth. Um, and then when the British came, they definitely, many of the missionaries tried to convert people to Christianity. Thanks to Raja Rammohn Roy, a lot of people don't understand him, don't study him. Because of him, actually, India could not be converted to Christian nation. There are many, many details. I have it in the second book I'm writing, but um, Christianity overall in India has limited impact in a sense that number of people converted was not that great. And now there are missionaries all over India trying to convert people, the tribals and the so-called Dalits. Um, yeah, it's a number. It's a it's a sort of a business, conversion business. So otherwise, Christianity had mild impact, but today this is a problem that many of the missionaries are using Hindu symbolism. For example, I have seen in one church, I forget where I was traveling, they have a Om in front of the church. Some of the missionaries are wearing saffron, and that is deceiving. Then let's come to the idea of Jesus in India. Now, I have been studying. I have not ended my research. I am not convinced that he was in India. I personally, as of today, I'm not convinced because all the evidences that I have found that he was in Puri, he was in Varanasi. There was a some saint called Isa, and he was in Tibet, and many saints and sages. I mean, Indian like Ramakrishna Mission Swamiji's and Prabhupada and many others said yes, they went to Tibet and found the scroll where it says Jesus was here, because the number of years in Jesus's life is missing in the Bible, in the biblical literature. You don't find the where was he for those years. So many people speculate that he was there in India, and perhaps it is very much possible that he could come to India and become a yogi and learn yoga, and the Buddha Dharma was there. He must have been influenced, but then I this Isa and Jesus the same. I have not found the strong link as yet. Many people say that it is the proof,
Yeah.
but then in Kashmir there is a tomb. They say this is the tomb of Jesus, and there are many theories. But if you look at the Theosophical Society leaders like Annie Besant and the previous one, Blavatsky, they speculated that missing years of Jesus, he was in some other area in the Middle East, and it could be that the Jesus comes from the Judaic traditions, Jewish traditions, and there were several sects of Judaism. One of them was Essenes. Essenes were more like a Buddhist, just matha type, like you celibrate, you observe celibacy and practice meditation. So Annie Besant is saying that Jesus was in some part of Middle East practicing Essenes religion, and that could be borrowed from India. There could be a Buddhist influence there, so that is a possibility. So there's a lot of ifs and buts about Jesus being India, but then there is a problem with those who are promoting this. Oh, Jesus was one of us. Now the missionaries will find a reason to say, "Hey, Jesus was a yogi. Why don't you follow Jesus also and
Yeah.
convert?" And then the whole Christian world, they don't like yoga. Majority, Vatican banned yoga. Now there is Christian yoga. That's another thing. So if Christianity, mainstream Christianity, does not accept yoga, then why we claim that Jesus was a yogi, and what benefit do we get from that? That doesn't mean we lose respect for this personality called Jesus, but we have to be very practical. We have to be realistic in projecting such ideas.
This is very interesting. And you also delve upon topics that are relatively unknown to the common man. In that sense, if academics had studied geopolitics in detail, or if you're somebody who's a history buff, perhaps people would know this. But concepts like Kafiristan, uh, the people over there, the nomadic tribes, and even the Hindus that are living today in isolation in many of these regions in the world, you touch upon those topics which barely anybody even touches upon. So, how do you go about finding a lot of these things, and what's so fascinating about the cultures? Um, and especially, I think one may even ask, what has enabled them to sustain in spite of so much aggression faced over the last few centuries?
So if you look up Kalash people, Kalash, you'll find that they are one of the minorities in Pakistan today. And they say that they are the most resilient, it even says most resilient minority community in Pakistan. So there's a province called Chitral, northwest frontier area. Chitral, you can imagine Chitral means picturesque, like really almost like a very beautiful valley. And and so there is an area called Nuristan, which is Nuristan is part between or split between Afghanistan and Pakistan today. So
Yeah,
when the invaders were coming from the west, this part of India they could not conquer. Actually, they could not conquer till they did, till 1560, I believe. I mean, 1860. Sorry, not 1860. These people were independent. So Alexander came, then all other invaders came, but this particular area, people must have been very, very resilient and strong, and they saved their culture. So when these invaders were not able to take it over, they called it Kafiristan, land of Kafirs, the land of infidels. Now, I was speculating, when, today India is also called Hindustan, but India could be called Kafiristan too, because it was a land of so-called, Kafirs by other cultures. So I have a feeling they must have thought about it. They may have used it, Kafiristan. Hindustan came much later, in my opinion. So if India, so the invaders finally settled in India. That's why probably they said, okay, let's not call it Kafiristan because they have to live there. So, but the Kalash people, if you look at their language is also Kalash. Their deities, their divinities, they're very similar to ours. But historians will say, no, 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 they were Greeks. Pakistan historians will say, no, 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 these are Muslims from this community. So there are a few thousand left, and I hope they are not converted 100. Tomorrow. A lot of traditions they follow are just like ours, and the name itself says Kalash. Picture, Kalash people.
right. Uh, Kanchanji, um, since you are dealing with such a big timeline, which perhaps even goes back to 2000 years, you also, towards the end of the book, you touch upon a lot of contemporary issues which India has grappled with of late. Do you see a particular pattern in which we as a society and a civilization have gone through? Yet every generation after the other, we fail to understand our own history and fall into the same trap again and again.
I would not fully agree with that. That we you know, people have this idea, and again, it is propagated by the uh, historians who had vested interest, that the invaders came from outside and they just took over India.
Yeah.
Actually, India was never won by any foreign invasions. No, never. Um, Even Alexander had to go back, um, and then it took more than 200 years for um, the forces of the caliphs to come inside India, Sindh and Balochistan and all this. It took long time, but at that same time, within 200 years, within actually less than 100 years, entire Africa, Persia, which is Iran, most of the Middle East, and parts of Europe, they were all invaded and conquered by the forces of the caliphs. But India did not fall. It took hundreds and hundreds of years. That means India fought. People of India fought, and they were strong, and they were able people, and stopped the invasion. Finally, there's a so it's not that history was not learned, and there's another myth was propagated that we were not united. And that's why this whole thing happened. Perhaps in many cases that could be the case. But if you were not united, how did we resist such forces for such a long time? Every Indian should study this part of history, that the heroic resistance that India gave, including women. In Sindh, in Punjab, you'll find women were fighting wars equally next to the men. So then the problem is today, when the colonists came, the British colonists, they wanted to tell us you don't have a history, you don't have any glorious past. So they started writing our history books. And that's where problems started happening. That, okay, so we know only the negative things about our history. That, okay, this is a nation which was invaded by a lot of nations, Huns and the Muslims. And then we came, it's a white man's burden. We need to save you guys. So they come. So when the history was distorted by the colonists, and then later on, after 47, our history was completely distorted by two sets of people. One was the Marxists, who
Yeah.
who would work closely with the Islamists and make sure that whitewash of all the atrocities by the past invaders and rulers are really complete whitewash of that was done. And the I mean, this is the challenge. The example was, first education minister of India was Abul Kalam Azad. Who he was? Maulana Abul Kalam Azad.
Yeah.
Maulana was born in Makkah. He never had modern education. He was educated as a Islamic scholar, but he did not have. Did he have idea about modern education? Did he go to college? Did he understand how system works and all this? Now he was made the first education minister of India by Jawaharlal Nehru. And what was his qualification? He was a nationalist leader, Congress leader. But if you read his history, his background, there's a lot of controversial parts of it. I don't want to get into this. So first, he made sure that history of Islamic era of India is cleaned up. Whatever people did, everything should be glorified. All the great palaces, all the grand buildings, they're all built by these people, as if there's no other architecture in India before that.
Right.
You go to south, you go to north, and thousands and thousands of temples are destroyed. But how many of them are occupied and reconstructed by the Mughals? That is a subject of research. I'm working on it with some people, that these so-called Islamic structures may not be Islamic structures. It was probably refurbished from the existing Hindu structures. But back to this part of the history, came Nurul Hasan. 1971, Indira Gandhi appointed Nurul Hasan as the education minister. There are several Muslims who are in this, like Chagla was there, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed there. So everybody try to make sure that the history is glorifying this. But what Nurul Hasan was, an additional thing. Nurul Hasan
Yeah.
was not only Muslim, but he was a Marxist. Then
Right.
all the Marxist historian, Irfan Habib, and all the names, Romila Thapar, all these people were deployed to rewrite basically Indian history. So the history we know today is basically written by the colonists, the Islamists, and the Marxists. So when are we going to have our own history written by our own peoples like R.C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sarkar? They have been banned. So we need new set of researchers and people to dig out this information. So mine is a small attempt towards that. And today's generation is waking up and learning these things. But we need a more concrete effort from the government, from the people, from the universities. Then only we will have the pride that
And
we
I'm
need
sure
to.
with the kind of books that we are seeing of late, there is a positive trend towards that as well. Uh, in my conversations, Kanchanji, with all humility, I say this: a lot of negative pat on our history is given usually by our historians because they say that we must always look back and see that we are a weak and a very submissive civilization. But in fact, you're the only second person to actually point this out. Recently, I was having a conversation with Dr. Vikram Sampath, and he touched upon the same lines where he said, I think we should give ourselves a break and finally be proud of the kind of resistance that we've put throughout the centuries. So I think you bring up a very important point. Uh, for anybody who's very interested to read this book, and we would highly recommend you to, we will put a link in the description below where you can purchase a copy of the book that has been written by Kanchanji. So that's it for today. And Kanchanji, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Yeah,
So
no, that's fine. It's great to be in conversation with you. But the book is The Crash of a Civilization. So that's the name of the book, and it is also written in Bengali, translated in Bengali. That's also available on. So the book is available on Amazon and Flipkart, both in India and outside. But it is great to talk to you, Sri Seti, today, and thank you for giving this opportunity to reach out to other
not at all.
people.
Thank you
And
very much for
thank
agreeing
you.
to speak to us. And I'm really sorry
No,
about the inconvenience that you had.
that's all right. No problem at all. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a good day.
Namaskar.